Hello everybody, my name's Dr. Marcus T. Anthony, and this is the very first in my series of videos on critical future studies. And in this episode I'm going to introduce you to critical future studies and especially the 6 pillars of future studies. So what are the 6 main areas of future studies? Well, let me tell you a little bit about myself first. I live here in China. This video is related to my day job, which is as an associate professor of foresight and strategy and in a university here. But I'm not going to tell you the name of the university because this actually is not part of my university course. It's just for those people who are interested in finding out a bit more about the kinds of things I do. Some of my students might also be interested in this. It's not actually part of my curriculum in the school. However, one thing I do appreciate about my school is that they allow me to design some very interesting courses, which is not always easy to do in university. So I teach this semester, for example, in my university, I'm teaching a course called Artificial Intelligence and the Future of the Mind, which is all about, just what it says, AI, and also how that relates to the idea of mind or consciousness. For example, can machines be conscious? Are they conscious? Will they ever be conscious in the future? And what is consciousness? The other course I'm teaching is related to the idea of making sense of the digital society, which is how we come to understand ourselves and our lives as more and more of our time is spent online and in the virtual and digital environments, because that really is changing the way we think of ourselves as people, as well as our society in general. So what is future studies, or critical future studies? What are the 6 pillars of future studies? So the first thing you really should know is that critical future studies is not merely about trying to predict the future. That's like yujian in Chinese. But trying to analyze it, 分析, the way we think about the future, and also especially trying to change it. What's the point of just trying to predict what's going to happen? We also want to have an impact or influence on the future. Otherwise, why bother studying it? Another important thing, there's more than one kind of future studies, okay? There's probably many, but there's just 3 that I'm going to tell you about in this video. The first one is what I call futurism. Futurism. And this is what probably most people think of when they think of future studies. It's some person, usually a man, who's interested in technology, and he's going to get up there and tell you about what's going to happen next in terms of the software and hardware that you're going to be able to use in the next 6 months or the next 5 years. And it's especially related to the idea of trends, 趋势 in Chinese. So what's going to happen next? But in my view, that's a little bit shallow because, as I said, we want to think about how we might change what's going to happen, or do we really want it to happen? The second kind is foresight. Foresight. In Chinese, that might be literally translated as yujian, but actually, it's similar to what I do, except that it's applied to mostly business contexts. So futurists will go into businesses, big and small, and try to help them to prepare for uncertainty and disruption. The thing is with that kind of future studies, of course, the bottom line is always profit or money, because businesses, of course, are mostly interested in how they can profit or benefit from any futurist or future studies ideas that come into that situation. And of course, that's perfectly understandable. Now, the last one I'm going to talk about is the one I'm talking about in detail today, critical future studies, 批判未来学, and it's about applying critical thinking or deep thinking to the idea of the future. And in particular, we want to ask some deeper and broader questions about the nature of the future, and also alternative future. An alternative is something different than what we might normally think of. Okay, I'm going to introduce you to three futurists. What kind of things do you think these futurists are interested in? Because basically, in future studies, you can talk about the future of almost anything, okay? So there are many different kinds of people in future studies. Firstly, Michio Kaku, Japanese American futurist, a senior citizen of future studies, if you like. He's particularly interested in futures of things like space travel, how human beings may go out into space. How can we possibly take civilization to other planets and stars when they're so far away? And he's particularly interested in energy. How can you energize or create enough energy to get a starship or massive amounts of human beings and equipment to other planets and other solar systems, given the huge distances? He's also interested in the UFO phenomena recently. So he's quite an interesting guy. But again, he's mostly talking about the application of technology. Okay, so I would class him in the category of futurism. Ray Kurzweil, another guy who I would tend to place in the category of futurism. Now, Mr. Kurzweil is famous for a few things. He's an engineer. He's a very smart guy. He's patented and developed many things in his time. One of the things that he's really famous for in recent times is the idea of neural uploading. So uploading your consciousness onto a computer. So he thinks that before we die, that we'll be able to upload our mind onto a computer so that even if our body passes, we'll be able to be conscious on a computer. Well, all I say is good luck to that, because number one, I don't want to live on a computer. Number two, I think he's confusing consciousness with machine learning. More about that in a later video. The second thing he's famous for is the idea of the singularity. The singularity is an idea that he came up with, which is the point in time when AI, artificial intelligence, will become smarter than human beings. And he thinks that's going to happen basically in this decade, the 2020s. So that's Ray Kurzweil and Michio Kaku. I don't consider them to be critical futurists because they don't really deeply question the nature of the future. They're mostly interested in technology and trends. Although Ray Kurzweil, and especially, you could say that he's interested in creating certain kinds of alternatives, but they're a little bit narrow in scope, I think. Okay, here's a third guy. Now, this fellow is what I would call a critical futurist. In fact, he's one of the perhaps grandfathers of critical future studies. He was one of the major influences on my thinking. His name is Sohail Inayatullah. And as you can tell from his name, he is his parents were not Anglo-American or Anglo-Australian. He is a Pakistani-American. Actually, his parents were born in Pakistan. Then he went to live in America when he was about 6. And he now spends quite a bit of his time in Australia. Firstly, he's the UNESCO Chair in Future Studies, so he holds a very important position in future studies. He also developed an idea that I'm going to tell you about in a moment called the 6 Pillars of Future Studies. Now, Sohail has worked with a lot of governments and organizations around the world, and he's particularly interested in deepening their understanding, deepening their relationship with the future. Okay, the 6 Pillars of Future Studies. So this idea or framework was developed by Sohail Inayatullah. 6 parts or pillars of future studies are what critical futurists think of, not just prediction. The first thing is mapping. Mapping the future, as you might understand, it comes from the word to map, or ditu in Chinese, and it's a verb in this case, and it means that you take the past, you look at information, how people think from the past, any trends or patterns you can see from the past to the present, and then thinking about how that might shape or affect the future, okay, including how it might influence the future negatively as well, or hold back the development of possible futures. Number 2, anticipation. So again, this is basically trends analysis, or trying to predict what's going to happen. So you look at trends that occur through time, patterns. They could be positive patterns, something is going up, or negative in the sense that something might be reducing, and then thinking about how that might change over time and create certain kinds of futures. Number 3, timing. You need to think about the time that things are going to happen, or we predict that they're going to happen. It's necessary for futurists to be quite clear about the time that they're talking about. So if you're talking about the future of cars, speaking about cars over the next year versus speaking of cars over the next 50 years, obviously there's a huge difference. So it's important that we think about timing. Number 4, deepening. Very important for critical futurists. Deepening means to question or ask more questions about the futures. Okay. Not just to assume that trends are going to continue and that we have to follow them. We can actually shape the future and influence and impact it. We can create futures that we prefer. Number 5, creating alternatives. So again, this is about coming up with some ideas or some vision of the future and then trying to move towards it, to create it. Okay? Which brings us to number 6, transforming. The way I see transforming is it's strategy, okay? Jianlue in Chinese. So you come up with a plan for the future. And by coming up with a vision and a plan, you can then move towards that preferred vision. Okay, so they're the 6 pillars of future studies. So that's the end of my first presentation or video on this topic about critical future studies. So thanks for listening. You can subscribe or like this, and that would help me a lot. And you can leave some comments below in English or in Chinese, both okay. And there's going to be some more videos coming up later on about future studies and some special topics, especially about artificial intelligence, 人工智能, and the future of the mind. Okay, so see you then.